Let's go.
Hey everybody, I'm Cole, Chair of ACM.
I'm Brady Sauls, President of the IEEE branch.
So we're very honored and excited to have Dr. Stallman here to speak to us tonight on free software. We wanted to thank a few people before we started, most notably the CS and ECE departments for all their help in logistics getting stuff set up, the Engineering Council and Program Coordinating Council for sponsoring the event, and of course, our partners here, IEEE. Did you want to say a few words?
We just wanted to, again, thank you, and it's an absolute honor to have you here in our building.
And then we'd also like to really thank our gnu+linux group who handled all the logistics here, most notably Wayland, who managed just tons of hard work in getting this event set up. So Wayland, would you like to come up here?
Hi everybody, my name is Waylon Morgan. Myself and John Shipp are the chairs of the gnu+linux users group at ACM here on campus. I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening. We're honored to have Dr. Richard Stallman here with us, who has graciously agreed to give his speech titled Free Software and Your Freedom. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Stallman.
First of all, it's very hot in here, and with so many of us, it's likely to get hotter. Can anybody do anything to increase the air conditioning? Please see if you can. If it's not obviously possible, call maintenance. It's important. It's going to get much hotter in here if we don't do anything to stop it. There is a table of stickers out there. The stickers are gratis. Please take as many as you can put to good use. If you know how to use 20 stickers, please take 20 stickers. Please don't put stickers on your shirt. That's not good use. It won't last past today. It's a waste of a good sticker. They're there to be used in effective ways, which means put in places that people will see them, not just today. Some requests for you. First, if you take a photo of me, please do not put it in Facebook or Instagram. That company is a monstrous surveillance engine. It does surveillance on its useds. I don't call them its users because, after all, who's using whom? And it does surveillance on the rest of the internet, too, through like buttons. If you visit a page and you see a Facebook like button, that means Facebook knows your computer visited that page. So our browser IceCat blocks the like buttons and many other things like them. But Facebook also does face recognition, so if you put the photo of somebody in Facebook, you give Facebook one more way to track that person. It's a bad way to treat your friends, and it's a bad way to treat me. Please don't do that to me. Of course, the best thing is not to be used of Facebook at all. Second, if you make a recording, audio, or video of this talk and you want to distribute copies, please do so solely in the formats that are favorable to free software. Those are the OGG formats and the WebM format, not in MP anything, because those are patented, especially not in Flash. It's very bad for any website to use Flash because it pushes people to run non-free software, meaning it attacks their freedom. And not in Windows Media Player, Real Player, or QuickTime. It's bad to distribute in QuickTime because iTunes is a very bad thing. Apple intentionally requires people to use non-free software to access iTunes. Somebody wrote free software that could do it, and Apple changed the protocol just to break it. So nothing should ever be distributed in iTunes. Anyone who does so is doing a very bad thing and deserves criticism. Make sure that normal use of the site of distribution does not lead people to run non-free software. This is why you shouldn't put it in YouTube. YouTube distributes WebM format, But in order to make it work, you have to run the non-free JavaScript code in the page, otherwise it just won't play. And please put on it the Creative Commons No Derivatives license, because this is a presentation of a point of view. So, what is free software? Free software is software that respects the user's freedom and community. So it's free as in freedom, not as in price. I do not mean gratis software. I'm not talking about the price at all, because that's a secondary practical detail. That's not an important ethical issue. So to understand the term free software, think of free speech, not free beer. Most languages have a clear word for this. In French, if I say it's libre, that's clear. I'm not saying gratuit. But in English, we have to. Every program embodies knowledge. If it's free software, that knowledge is available for the users to learn. They can understand it. They can maintain, adapt, and extend the program. They can also use that knowledge in other ways. But the use of a proprietary program is not development, it's dependence, imposed dependence on one particular entity. It's a social problem. We should aim to put an end to the use of that proprietary program when we see it. To write a free program and distribute it as free software is a contribution to society. How much depends on the details. If it's very useful, it contributes a lot. If it's hardly useful at all, it contributes very little. But at least by being distributed as free software, it offers to society however much it has to contribute. Writing a proprietary program is not a contribution because it's a power grab. It's an attempt to subjugate people. In social terms, that program is a trap. If it has attractive features, those are the bait. Paradoxically, attractive features do not make a proprietary program better. They make it more dangerous and harmful. So if you have the choice to either develop proprietary software or do nothing at all, you should do nothing at all, because this way you're not doing harm. Developing or promoting proprietary software is doing harm to society. Of course, in real life, you'll usually have other options which are better than both of those, so take them. But if we're comparing just these two options, you should do nothing rather than advance a system that subjugates people. Thus, all programs should be free so that all their users can be free. That's the aim of the free software movement. Proprietary software is evil because it restricts the users, but it tends to go with another evil, that of malware. Malware means programs designed so that their functioning hurts the user or can hurt the user. So this is a completely different kind of problem from proprietary software. Free versus proprietary software, that's not a matter of what's in the code. It's only a matter of how the code is distributed. Whereas malware is purely a matter of what's in the code. So philosophically, they're orthogonal, but in practice, they tend to go together. Proprietary software is commonly malware. What does malware do? Sometimes it spies on the user. We call that spyware. Sometimes it's designed to restrict the user, to stop users from doing the things that obviously they're going to want to do, that the developer knows they're going to want to do and doesn't want to let them do. This is known as DRM, Digital Restrictions Management, or digital handcuffs. Then there are backdoors. Backdoors receive commands from somebody else to do something to the user that the user may not like, but the user doesn't get a choice. And then there's censorship. Nowadays, some proprietary packages are designed to impose censorship on their users. Malware in proprietary software is quite common. In fact, nearly all users of proprietary software are victims of known cases of proprietary malware. I can prove it with a list. One proprietary package that does all four of these nasty things that you may have heard of is called Microsoft Windows. People have found spy functionalities in Windows that send data to servers. The digital handcuffs, of course, the users can see. That can't be hidden. If the product doesn't offer any way to do the thing you want to do, you can see that. But that doesn't enable users to fix the problem. The backdoors are not so easy to find, but we know of 3 backdoors in Windows. The censorship is censorship of application programs. It's a new malfeature in Windows 8 for mobile devices. It means that users can't freely install whatever applications they wish. They can only install the applications approved by Microsoft from Microsoft's App Store. So Windows is malware. Programmers have been calling Windows malware for decades, but they were exaggerating. I'm not exaggerating. This is the literal fact. But in fact, it's even worse. One of the backdoors is universal. A universal backdoor offers somebody the means to impose software changes at a distance. Microsoft can install any change in Windows by force when it wishes, without asking the permission of the nominal owner of the computer. I say nominal owner because, in fact, once there's Windows running in that computer, Microsoft has owned that computer. So any malicious functionality that is not present in Windows today could be imposed tomorrow. So Windows is universal malware. Other operating systems are malware too. Apple's are malware. macOS has digital handcuffs, and people have, in the past year, found spy functionalities in it too. It tends to send unsaved drafts, works that have not been published, to Apple servers. So macOS is malware, but the software of the iThings, Apple's newer monsters, is much worse. There are various spy functionalities. Apple can remotely extract various personal data from an iPhone at any time. There are digital handcuffs, of course. There is a backdoor with which Apple can forcibly delete applications. And Apple pioneered the censorship of applications. Microsoft copied it from Apple. When users of the iPhone found ways to defeat this censorship and install applications not approved, such as anything that's free software, Apple doesn't approve free software, they called it jailbreaking, recognizing in effect that those computers are designed to be jails for their users. That was the evil genius of Steve Jobs. He figured out how to make computers that are jails for their users and make them so shiny that millions of fools would clamor to be jailed. So Apple's operating systems are malware. So is Android. Now, parts of Android are free software. Parts are proprietary. That's as Google releases it. Now, in the telephone, the free parts could be made proprietary, and in some cases they are. But even if they're not, the other parts are proprietary. One of them is Google Play, which is used for loading applications from Google's App Store. That's not just proprietary. It contains a backdoor that allows Google to forcibly install or deinstall applications. And I think that that amounts more or less to a universal backdoor. If you want a free version of Android, the only one is Replicant. Look at replicant.us. Flash Player is malware. It has digital handcuffs and a functionality for websites to recognize visitors. It's like cookies, but it's different. Users know about cookies. They may delete their cookies. They mostly don't know that Flash Player has its own cookies. Now, Flash Player is an instructive example because it's gratis, but it's not free. And it is as nasty as is typical for proprietary software. This example shows that the fact Flash Player is gratis is of no importance to us. It means that Adobe does not make users pay to be abused. Angry Birds is malware. It sends geolocation data to companies. The software in the Amazon swindle is malware. I'm talking about Amazon's ebook reader. Swindle is not its official name, but it's the name that describes the product right, because it swindles readers out of the traditional freedoms of readers of books, like the freedom to get the book anonymously, paying cash, for instance, which is the only way I ever buy a book. But Amazon doesn't accept cash. It makes users identify themselves, so it maintains a giant database listing all the books each user has obtained, which is a threat to human rights. We must destroy that database. We cannot tolerate its existence. But even if you got the book from someplace else, Amazon still knows, because the swindle reports what book is being read and what page. So it's totally surveilled reading. Then there's the freedom to give the book to someone else after you've read it, or lend it to various people from time to time when you wish, or sell it to a used bookstore so that I might buy it there, or maybe you might buy it there. Well, Amazon abolishes all those freedoms with the digital handcuffs and the swindle, together with the contracts that say you're not allowed to own a book. You see, Amazon does not respect private property. Amazon says all of your books belong to us. It imposes a system of communism more extreme than the Soviet Union. Then there's the freedom to keep the book as long as you wish. Amazon eliminates that with a back door for erasing books. We know about this by observation. In 2009, Amazon remotely erased thousands of copies of a particular book in an Orwellian act. Somebody came to my talk once and told me that the book disappeared as he was reading it. And what was the book? It was 1984 by George Orwell. The book that gave us the expression, "Big Brother is watching you." Although Orwell didn't imagine surveillance as total as is being implemented today in the United States, his model was the Soviet Union. And there's far more surveillance of all of you today than there was in the Soviet Union. Well, there was a lot of criticism, so Amazon stated a promise that it would never do this again unless ordered to by the state. If you've read 1984, that's not a very comforting promise. 1984 presents a totalitarian state whose crimes began with burning the books it didn't like. The official name of this product is the Kindle. Since Kindle means to start a fire, perhaps that's meant to suggest that its real purpose is remote virtual book burning. But don't worry about this promise. In fact, it wasn't seriously intended to be kept. It was just a noise meant to make the critics shut up until they found out later that things were back to the way they were before. Amazon has, in fact, gone back to remotely erasing books. By the way, there's also a universal backdoor in the swindle software. My last example is nearly all portable phones. Even if it's not a smartphone, it's a computer with software that can be changed, not by the user, but by a company, yes. And there are two malicious functionalities in it. First of all, it will send the GPS location on remote command, and the user can't block that. Second, it has a universal backdoor, because the software can be changed remotely through the phone radio network. And that has been used to convert them into listening devices that listen all the time and transmit all the conversation they hear. The NSA has an advanced version that only transmits interesting conversations. And you don't have to speak into the microphone. It can listen to you from over there. And if you would like to get some privacy by switching it off, surprise, it pretends to switch off, but it keeps on running and listening and transmitting. The only way to make it stop is to take out the batteries. Take out all the batteries. But some models have a secondary battery that can't be removed. In some models, no battery can be removed. I wonder why. When I first thought about maybe getting a portable phone, I found out these things and realized that they are Stalin's dream. Stalin would have loved to give everyone in the Soviet Union a device that would always say where they are, where they were, and would listen to them all the time, but they didn't exist yet. By the way, the NSA, thanks to that great hero, Edward Snowden, we know that the NSA, 3 cheers for Edward Snowden. Hip, hip, hooray. Hip, hip, hooray. Hip, hip, hooray. So thanks to Snowden, we know that the NSA figures out that two people know each other by seeing that their portable phones are close together. So when I found these things out, I decided that I could not have a portable phone. Some things are just too horrible that we must not accept them. So I'm doing my duty as a citizen by not carrying a portable tracking and listening device. Well, those examples are enough to prove my point, because nearly everyone that uses proprietary software uses at least one of these. So they're the victims of known proprietary malware. I could give you more examples, but there isn't time and it's not necessary. Look at gnu.org/philosophy/proprietary for documentation of these and many other examples of proprietary malware. But the point is, what about all the other proprietary programs I haven't mentioned? Well, in some cases, we know the program is malware, and in some cases, we don't know. Those are the only possibilities. It's never possible to be sure that it isn't malware, because they don't allow us to check. So it's either we know it's bad or we don't know. In other words, to have confidence in a proprietary program requires blind faith. There's no other way. If you want rational trust in a program, it's got to be free software. every non-free program, I presume, is not malware. Some of them are malware and some are not, but we can't tell which is which. So we have to regard every proprietary program as potential malware. And why is this? Why is malware so common in proprietary software? It's because the developer has power over the users, and nowadays the developer knows it, and therefore feels the temptation to take advantage of that power to gain further advantage over those users, to make more money by pushing them down or mistreating them somehow. 30 years ago, proprietary software developers had an ethical scruple against making the software malicious. It was an injustice that the users didn't have control over the software, but it was shocking when we found out that any given program was malware. But nowadays, that scruple is gone. The ethical standards have gone through the floor. It's now normal and standard practice to look for ways to make the program malware. In fact, that's often the business model. That's the reason they develop the program, because it's going to be malware. But in the free world, we contributors to free software know that we don't have power. The users control the program. And so we don't. If we put in something the users don't like, they'll change it. So we don't feel the same temptation. And that's why malware is rare in free software. In fact, free software is the only known defense against malware. When the users have control over the program, they can look at the source code, and they do. Mostly it's not because they're deciding to check whether it's malware. Mostly it's because they want to fix a bug or add a feature. But when the users read the source code, they also have a chance to see if it's doing anything nasty. And if they see that it is, they have a chance to fix it and announce what they found. This is a defense. It's not perfect. It's not guaranteed. But it's much better than being defenseless like the users of proprietary software. So, free software is also the only software that you can rationally trust. And thus, software should be free. Proprietary software is a harmful social practice. It should not exist. And the way to get rid of it is to resist it with the various activities in your life. Don't use it, don't develop it, and teach others not to use it or develop it, and push back against anyone that pushes you to use it or develop it. I launched the free software movement in 1983 when I announced the plan to develop a free operating system called GNU. Now, in order for rejecting proprietary software to be a real option, we've got to have free software to use. The computer won't do anything without an operating system, and in 1983, all the operating systems for modern computers were proprietary. If you bought a new computer, to make that computer do anything, you needed to have an operating system in it, which was always proprietary, and there went your freedom. There was no way to use a computer in freedom. I decided to change that. I wanted to make it possible to get a computer and use it in freedom. And since I was an operating system developer, I saw a way to do this. All I had to do was write an operating system. Then, as its author, I could legally make it free software. Then, anyone would be able to get a computer and run it in freedom by using my system. In other words, I had the chance to save people from the injustice of non-free software by doing technical work in my own field. I was aware of the injustice of proprietary software, which most people didn't recognize as an injustice. I had the skills to try to save people from this injustice, and it looked like nobody would do it if I did not. That meant I had been elected by circumstances to do this work. It was my duty. It's as if you see somebody drowning and there's no one else around and you know how to swim and it's not Bush. Then you have a duty to save that person. Well, actually, perhaps that statement is too strong. Perhaps there are other people we could identify about whom I should not make the claim that you have a moral duty to save them, like Cheney and Bush's torturers and people like Obama that protect Bush's torturers and I don't know who else. Fortunately, I don't need to resolve these questions because I don't know how to swim. But in the real case in my life, the work to be done was not swimming, it was writing lots of code. And I knew how to do that. So I decided to develop an operating system that would be entirely composed of free software. You see, an operating system is a collection of hundreds, then it was hundreds, now it's likely to be thousands of different programs. And in order for that collection to respect your freedom, each and every piece in it must respect your freedom. If there is one piece that's proprietary, then that takes away users' freedom, which means that the collection as a whole takes away users' freedom. So I had to develop a system that would be composed entirely of free software. Every line would be free. Then I decided to do this, and then I decided to recruit other people to write parts of it to get it done sooner. Then I decided to make it a Unix-like system, compatible with Unix with the same basic design, in order to have the same technical advantages as Unix and to make it easy for people to switch from Unix. Unix was a proprietary operating system, so using it was not a solution. But it was advanced in certain ways and was popular. So compatibility with Unix was a technical advantage for this project. Then I gave it a name, which is a joke, because no matter how serious your project is, you still want to have jokes. The system's name is GNU. It's spelled GNU, and it's a recursive acronym. It stands for GNU's Not Unix. So it's GNU, GNU's Not Unix. And this, in addition to being a recursive acronym, was also the customary way in my community to give credit in such a case. Although Unix was unethical, I was getting technical ideas from it, and this recognized that. Now, in order to be a play on words, it needs two meanings. The recursive acronym is just one. So why GNU? Why not ANU, FNU, or SNU? Because those are not words. But GNU is a word. It's the name of this animal that lives in Africa. So now we've got two meanings. It's a joke. But it's much better than that. You see, according to the dictionary, in this word, the G is silent and it's pronounced new. So every time you want to write the word new, you can spell it GNU and you've got a joke. Perhaps not a very good joke, but there are lots of them. So we've been taught to associate this word with laughter. So it's the ideal name for any programming project. But when it's the name of our system, please do not follow the dictionary. You see, if you say, I'm using the new operating system, you're mistaken, We've been working on it for 31 years now and using it for 23 years, so it's not new anymore. But it still is GNU, and it will always be GNU, so please pronounce the name GNU. There's another erroneous pronunciation that people need to avoid, which sounds like Linux. It's strange that so many people, when they talk about the GNU system, call it Linux by mistake. How did that mistake get started? Well, during the 1980s, our work in the GNU project, the project to develop the GNU operating system, was to come up with all the components we needed. I wrote some of them. In some cases, I recruited somebody to write them. In some cases, I persuaded developers to free their code because I wanted to use it in GNU. For instance, the BSD system existed in 1983. It was a proprietary variant of Unix. And in order to get Berkeley to give you the source code, you had to show an AT&T source license for Unix, which cost $50,000. I visited the people at Berkeley in 1985, and I said, "Why are you donating all your work to AT&T? That's not a charity. How about separating your code from AT&T's code so you can release your code as free software?" A few years later, they started doing that, with the result that we could use that code in GNU. And in some cases, another project developed a program and made it free software, not because they were intending to make a free operating system, but nonetheless, their work turned out to be useful for that. By 1990, we had almost all of the initial system except one major component which was missing, the kernel. The kernel of an operating system is the component that allocates the machine's resources to the other programs you run. We started developing a kernel in 1990. The Free Software Foundation hired someone to write it. I chose the overall design. I chose that we would use an existing microkernel as the bottom half of our kernel, so we would only have to write the top half. I thought this way it's only half the work. And we would end up with an elegant, advanced, powerful kernel too, in less time, I thought. But it turned out to be somewhat of a research project, and it took 6 years to get a test version running. That was unfortunate. But fortunately, we didn't have to wait for it, because in 1992, Mr. Torvalds, who had written a proprietary kernel called Linux, liberated it. So he started in 1991, but during that year, its license was not free. It was too restrictive. But in 1992, he re-released it under the GNU General Public License, which was the free software license I had written for releasing pieces of GNU. So that meant his kernel Linux became free software. And it was possible to fit Linux into the gap in the GNU system, making a complete free system, which was basically GNU, but also contained Linux. In other words, it was the GNU+Linux system. But the people who put them together were not us. You see, we thought that our kernel would be running very soon and it would be more advanced and powerful and elegant. But other people put them together, and they were focusing their attention mainly on this latest component, the kernel. They regarded all the rest of the system as a small add-on to this kernel. So they started talking about the combination as a Linux system, and that spread to millions of people so that when they use the GNU system, they call it Linux, which is not nice. So please call the system GNU+Linux. Please give us equal mention. Since we started the development of it many years earlier, and since we contributed the biggest piece of all the code, I think equal mention is something that is fair for us to ask. But it's true, credit is not the most important ethical issue in life. There's something much more important at stake in your choice of the name to use for this system. Your freedom is at stake. Indirectly, of course, because directly the name does not change the thing. If you call roses onions, that won't change the roses, but it might get some cooks confused. And indirectly, it might change the roses. They might start breeding roses that smell like onions for the sake of those confused cooks. You see, the words you choose determine the message you convey, which affects the thinking of other people, which guides their actions. So it makes a difference which words you choose. Since 1983, the name GNU has been associated with these ideas of freedom, but the name Linux is associated with a very different idea, with the ideas of Mr. Torvalds. What are they? Torvalds doesn't agree with the free software movement. He never did. He doesn't believe that you deserve freedom, that you deserve to have the control of the programs you use. He doesn't believe he deserves freedom in his computing either. He says he's content to use proprietary software as long as it's powerful and reliable. And he has a right to promote his views. But it's not right that he gets to stand on the platform which consists of our work and use that platform to attack the philosophy which motivated our work. And that's exactly what happens when people attribute our work to him by calling it Linux. People, many people, most people who've heard of the GNU system think it's Linux, think it was started in 1991 by Mr. Torvalds, so they admire him tremendously and they assume the system comes from his vision of this issue. So they tend to adopt his views and dismiss ours without serious consideration. And so they believe that they don't deserve freedom either. And they don't fight for their freedom, and we could all lose because of that. Freedom is frequently threatened. To keep it, you have to defend it. That's true in all areas of life. To defend your freedom, you have to value it, and to value it, you have to understand the idea. Computing is a new area of life, and most people have never thought about the question of whether they deserve any freedoms in the use of a program. There has never been a real public debate about the question of what freedoms a user deserves in using a program. And this is because nearly everybody started doing computing with proprietary software surrounded by other users of proprietary software, and they didn't imagine there could be any other way. So they took for granted that proprietary software was a legitimate option, a legitimate way of distributing software, which means that in effect they let the proprietary developers dictate the answer to this question: what human rights do you deserve in using a program? And they dictated essentially none at all. They dictated that they can impose any conditions they like, and the users can either take it or leave it. And if all the competing programs impose the same conditions, perhaps not even by coincidence, that's tough on the users. They still can only take it or leave it. So who is trying to start this debate? We in the free software movement believe we have identified 4 human rights that the user of a program deserves in using that program. They are the 4 essential freedoms that define free software. We believe that these are inalienable rights. They should never be taken away from any user except as a punishment for wrongdoing. But when we try to bring these ideas to the attention of the users of the GNU system or anyone else, we encounter two obstacles. One is the users don't know about the GNU system. They think it's Linux. They think it was started by Mr. Torvalds. And they call themselves Linux users. So when they see our articles that talk about these ideas, they say, why should I read that? That comes from those GNU extremists. I'm a Linux user, so I admire the pragmatic ideas of Mr. Torvalds. Pragmatic in this context means the tendency to take important long-term decisions based on short-term convenience. I don't think it's a wise way to decide, but they think of it as a term of praise. So they pay no attention to what we said, and in fact, they're using the GNU system, but they don't know it because they think it's Linux. How ironic. If they knew what that system really is, they would respond differently. They'd say, I'm using gnu/linux, and here are articles from the developers of GNU about the philosophy that led them to develop the system that I love. I should pay attention. And then we'd have a chance to convince them that they deserve freedom and they should fight for it. And then we might all win. So we all have something at stake in that. And you can help make them aware of this. Just call the system gnu/linux when you mention it. Especially when you're in a conversation with others that are calling it Linux. That's your opportunity to educate people about this point. But there's another obstacle, the term, quote, open source, unquote. You'll find that lots of people never mention the term free software. They call it, quote, open source, unquote. And the reason is so that they can disconnect it completely from any ideas of freedom or right and wrong. As gnu/linux started developing momentum in the 90s, they began it began drawing a lot more people into the community, and some of them didn't care about freedom. They were just interested in using the software. There were people who helped develop the software but weren't interested in freedom. So there were two political camps in the community. There was the free software movement, those of us who were developing this software so we could live in freedom, and there were the ones who didn't care about freedom, but they were in the community. They used or distributed or developed free software. So we had a disagreement, we had a debate, and people coming into the community could see the debate, and that way they'd find out about the free software movement. But in 1998, some of the people in that camp coined the term open source so that they could have a way to talk about our community and its software without hinting at any idea of freedom. With their new term, they had a chance to construct a different discourse. They could include whichever ideas they wanted and omit the ones they wanted. They omitted the idea of freedom entirely. They presented it not as an ethical question, but just a matter of convenience. For us, the values are freedom and community. For them, the values are powerful, reliable, convenient code, and nothing deeper than that. And their aim is to avoid and hush up any criticism of proprietary software on ethical grounds. For them, the idea that a common business practice could be wrong is too shocking to even be thought, let alone spoken about. So where we say, if you develop and distribute a program, you are morally obliged to recognize and respect the user's freedoms to change and redistribute this software. They'll say, if you develop and distribute a program, it may be in your practical interest to let the users develop and redistribute this program, because they'll make the code better. So they don't appeal to anything deeper than code quality. And they don't say it's a moral obligation. It's just a suggestion that you might, they say, follow on some occasions and not on others. The most crucial part of the idea is what's missing from their views. Well, they were the majority in 1998, and the companies in the community were mostly on their side. So the politicians and journalists mostly followed them. And since then, we have to work hard to make the users of our software aware that there's such a thing as a free software movement. And we're hampered by many articles which give the impression that open source replaced the free software movement, which is not so. We're still here. We still have activists, probably more than we did then. But since then, we have to work hard to inform people that we exist, because they're so much more numerous and they're blocking us from public view as much as they can. In fact, most people who've heard of me think that I support open source. They think I agree with those people. Every week I get messages thanking me for my contributions to open source. I have to write back, I'm afraid you've been misinformed. Open source is the slogan of people who disagree with me. What I do is called free software, free as in freedom. I've even seen articles that called me the father of open source. So I said, if I'm the father of open source, when I see that, I send a letter to the editor saying, if I'm the father of open source, it was conceived through artificial insemination using stolen sperm without my knowledge or consent. Then I present the ideas of the free software movement, and that's the purpose of the letter, to show the readers of that periodical these ideas that were missing from the article. But I like to start it with a joke, because it's fun, and maybe that will convince them to print my letter. So it's a big task we have to face, to make the public aware that there's such a thing as the idea of free software, which is a deeper idea than the, quote, open source, unquote, idea that they've heard. And first of all, that it's different. So your help is needed. When you're in a discussion with other people and they're talking about open source, if you persistently say free software or free/Libre software and present ethical arguments, and you are persistent, and never mind how many people disagree with you, you will help spread awareness. And don't worry if they all ridicule you. You're not talking to them really. You're talking for the sake of others who are in the discussion. If they learn about the free software movement and that people support it, you're winning. And it doesn't matter whether you convince the people who have made up their mind the other way. If you want to make a big contribution to the free software movement, give speeches. You don't have to start with a big audience. Speak to 5 people, and then speak to 10 people. Practice. It took me practice. You can practice too. You can learn this. You could go to a Toastmasters club to get practice in public speaking. It's a lot of fun also. The point is, that's a form of help that we need very much. Spreading the idea, organizing political campaigning for free software is very important, just as important as writing code. Because our future depends above all on what we value. If we want to establish a lasting freedom, it's not enough just to hand people freedom today. We have to teach them to value freedom so they won't give it up. Otherwise, in 5 years, they probably won't have it anymore. The fool and his freedom are soon parted. So if we could give everybody, if we could magically have free software today for every job, we could distribute it, and tomorrow all the users could have freedom. But in 5 years, they could lose it. Someone would develop some proprietary program that's attractive and offer it to them. And if they don't know why they should say no, they'll give in to the temptation and they'll lose freedom, perhaps without realizing what it is they're losing. So we have to teach them what it is they'd be losing. We have to show them that it's important. And the way you teach people values is by talking about them and acting on them yourself. Because there are so many people in our community who don't value freedom, who are open source supporters, it's not unusual that in the development of a free program, there are people who are doing it based on open source ideas. But actually, it doesn't matter whether the developers of a particular program agree on these political ideas. As long as they're all willing to work on making that program better, they can work together just fine. So if someone offers to help a project, say a GNU package, we don't ask, do you agree with the free software movement? For that job, it doesn't matter. We don't need to ask what the person's politics are. We just say, oh, thanks for helping. Because as long as they're helping to make that program better, usually it doesn't matter why they want to do so. But sometimes there's a decision to be made that goes beyond the improvement of that program's code. And then it may matter what their values are. For instance, they're working on program P. Suppose it turns out that it's very convenient to use P if you're using proprietary program Q. Then the developers of P might get the idea, let's try to publicize Q, because when people start using Q, they will like our program better, and our program P will become more popular. If they are open source supporters, that will look attractive to them because they don't have a goal beyond success, popularity. And they don't recognize anything wrong with program Q. So they will want to publicize Q. But the free software activists in the development of P will say, we can't publicize Q because Q is an injustice. It's a proprietary program. It attracts people to give up their freedom, and it's wrong for us to suggest that people give up their freedom. So we must not promote Q. See, at this point, it makes a difference what those developers of P value, whether they value freedom or not. And we've seen disagreements like this over and over. For instance, if you want to install gnu+linux, you'll use a distro. A distro, or distribution, is a packaged version of gnu+linux designed to be easy to install. There are over 1,000 distros. And almost all of them contain non-free software because they're developed by people who don't value freedom as an ethical point, by open source people. And they think that putting in the non-free software will make their distros more attractive. And maybe they're right. And they don't recognize an overriding reason not to do that. Fortunately, there are a few distros that are entirely free software. For instance, Ututo, and gnu+linux, and Triskel, and Parabola, and a few more. They're listed in gnu.org/distros. But those are not the well-known popular distros. Those are non-free distros. And they influence our community not to value freedom. Consider the example of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a non-free distro. It has a lot of free software in it, but it also has non-free programs. And it's one of the rare examples of free malware because Ubuntu contains free software that spies on users. Now, the community has used its defense. There are modified versions of Ubuntu where the spying is turned off. But still, it's bad for the reputation of our community that something as well known as Ubuntu continues to have that malicious functionality. But also, Ubuntu installs lots of non-free software. And this means people who think that it would be good to install gnu+linux, if they pick Ubuntu, they don't reach freedom. But the worst thing about Ubuntu is the influence it exercises in the community, because the people who develop Ubuntu, they could say, you deserve freedom in your computing and you won't get it from us. They could, but they don't. Because they don't want to make themselves look bad. They don't want to suggest values by which they would look bad. So instead they say, we offer the best possible user experience. The way you teach values is by talking about them and acting on them. What they're teaching with that discourse is value convenience, not freedom, which is the exact opposite of what we need to do to establish lasting freedom. Then there are the applications with add-ons. Firefox is an example. It comes with a list of add-ons. Some of them are non-free. The developers of Firefox, although Firefox itself is free software, the developers are not free software supporters. They have open source views. And they decided to make their program more popular by including non-free add-ons in their list. So for our browser, IceCat, which is a modified version of Firefox, we list only the free add-ons because we think it's wrong to lead other people to give up their freedom. Most of the changes in IceCat are designed to protect users' privacy. Then there is OpenOffice. It's free software, but as you can tell by the name, it's developed by people in the open source camp. And they have a list of add-ons, some of which are non-free. They would list anything. They had no ethical criterion about it. So we began developing a list of only the free add-ons. And then another group made a fork of OpenOffice called LibreOffice. Those people are free software activists, and they took over our list of free add-ons. So we're happy to be distributing LibreOffice and not OpenOffice. This sort of thing is likely to happen whenever there's a free program for which add-ons are distributed and it's developed by people in the open source camp. It's even happened inside the source code, supposed source code of Linux, the kernel. If you look in the source files, you'll see some of them which contain a long list of numbers. Those are actually executable programs dressed up as source code. They're dressed up as C by taking the form of a long list of numbers. But really, that's an executable program. The source code is not available, so they're not free software. And some of them are covered by explicit non-free licenses, too. So what are they doing in the supposed source files of Linux? Torvalds decided to put them in there. See, these are, you see, for him, this was never an ethical question. He didn't have any principles that required soul searching. He started releasing Linux as proprietary software. Then he made it free software, and some years later, he started putting in these non-free pieces, which are called blobs. And this shows when your freedom depends on somebody who doesn't value the freedom, your freedom is precarious because he may make what he considers solely a practical decision to stop supporting freedom. Of course, he didn't do this on a whim. These programs are firmware for certain peripherals or coprocessors which won't run unless the system installs that stuff into them. By the way, it's time to go and resume selling merchandise because people are starting to leave. Could you manage to do that? It's time to do it now. This is Free Software Foundation merchandise, and by buying it, you support our work. The remaining stickers are not for today. These are for my talk tomorrow. I want to have stickers at both talks.
Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you. So, by buying our buttons and books and shirts, you're supporting us. And I can sign the books and the shirts. So, the underlying problem is those pieces of hardware can't be used in the free world. There are two possible reactions to that. One, if you value freedom most, you just say, sorry, we can't support those. We're not going to give you the non-free programs or point you at the non-free programs to run them with because that's unethical. It's wrong. That's our reaction. But for Torvalds and other people who are open source supporters, they want success by giving convenience and they don't value freedom. So they put those non-free programs into their system, in this case into Linux, the kernel, and it looks like those hardware pieces work, and the people don't realize that they're running non-free software and they've lost some freedom that way. Of course, what we really want to do is have free replacements for those programs, but that's hard to do. Why don't we have them already? Because the manufacturers refuse to tell us how to use that hardware. That's a secret. When you say, how do we talk to your hardware? They say, here's a non-free program you can use. Run it and shut up. So once in a while, we can convince one to start cooperating, but otherwise, the only solution is reverse engineering. If you want to make an important technical contribution to the free world, do reverse engineering. This university should have a course in reverse engineering, focusing on figuring out how to use peripherals. If it doesn't, it really needs to. It's also a very, very good professional career. There are not many people who do it, and they get lots of demand. So we're going to have to keep fighting for freedom. We need your support. But nowadays, I should say something about the various kinds of free software licenses. First of all, why does a free program need a license? Because by default, every program is regulated by copyright law, and that's all. And copyright law applies to anything that's written down, such as a program. And by default, it says that people are forbidden to copy it or change it or redistribute it. In many countries, they're not even allowed to run it without explicit permission. So if you don't put a free license on a program, it's not free. The way a program becomes free is by an explicit declaration by the copyright holders giving users the 4 freedoms. Any such declaration that gives users the 4 freedoms is a free software license. So this is the opposite of a proprietary software license. The purpose of a proprietary software license, which is typically a contract, is to take away the residual rights that copyright allows to users. They want to restrict people even more, so they make users agree to this contract. Whereas we want to give the users the freedom that copyright takes away. So we just say, here you are, you've got these freedoms. So there are many ways to write a free software license. But the main distinction is between copyleft licenses and non-copyleft licenses. Copyleft is designed to make sure that every user gets freedom. But there are unscrupulous developers that would like to take our source code, perhaps make some changes in it, compile it, and distribute binaries without freedom. And they'll do it if we don't stop them. So I invented a way to stop them. That's copyleft. It consists of a free software license that puts a certain kind of condition on how to exercise freedoms 2 and 3. Freedom 2 is the freedom to make exact copies to distribute to others when you wish. Freedom 3 is about copies of your modified versions, the freedom to make copies and then give or sell them to others when you wish. Well, copyleft puts a condition on how you distribute them to others. It has to be with source code under the same license and other similar requirements, just to make sure that those middlemen have to respect the user's freedom just as we respected the middlemen's freedom. What copyleft says is, with the code must go the freedom. Everyone that gets the code must get the freedom, and changes in the code are not an excuse to take away the freedom. The main copyleft license for software is the GNU General Public License, or GNU GPL. I wrote version 1 in 1989. Before that, I had written copyleft licenses for specific GNU programs. But in 1989, I worked out how to have just one license that applied to every program which said the GNU GPL applies to this program. So all the programs under a copyleft license could use exactly the same license. We're now on version 3 of the GNU GPL. The other licenses are more or less pushover licenses. These licenses permit middlemen to strip away the freedom and redistribute binaries without source code. Perhaps they have to change the program to do that, but of course it's easy to change a program. And the result is, for a lot of the users, it's not free software. This happens to many of the programs in Android too. Those that are free as Google publishes them often arrive proprietary in a phone because, with the exception of Linux, the kernel, They're all under a pushover license. This is why it's very important to copyleft your work. By copylefting your work, you are defending freedom for everyone that gets a copy. If you use a pushover license, you're giving the middlemen more ammunition to take away users' freedom with. Of course, they will complain and say, you're restricting us by saying we have to respect the user's freedom. My response to that is this haiku. Using GPL is encroaching on our rights to encroach on yours. That's the point of view of the proprietary software developer who complains that you're using the GPL. Nowadays, it's possible to run non-free programs without knowing that you're in your machine as you browse the web. Many web pages contain programs. These programs can be free or proprietary like any other programs. If they come with source code and a free license, they're free. Otherwise, they're proprietary. Mostly, they're proprietary. We refer to these programs as JavaScript programs because that's the license they're mostly written in. But really, that's just a detail to identify them. The issue is the same for them as it is with any other program. They can be free or not. But normally, you don't even choose to run them because you visit a page and it happens to contain the non-free program, so that gets installed into your browser and runs in your computer, and the browser doesn't tell you unless it's IceCat. Because IceCat, by default, has Libre.js. Libre.js is an add-on for Firefox, which is included by default in IceCat, which we developed to protect you from running non-free JavaScript code. It analyzes all the JavaScript code that tries to get into your browser to see if it's either trivial or free. In those cases, it's allowed to run. But if it's non-trivial and non-free, Libre.js blocks it and warns you. It does one other thing. It informs you on the screen of where to send a complaint to the webmasters. It's very important to complain to the webmasters about non-free JavaScript code. But if you've ever tried complaining to the webmasters, you know that the hardest part is figuring out where to send the complaint. That's the time-consuming part. But Libre.js does that for you, heuristically searching the site. It'll show you some places to complain. You can click, and in just a minute, you can send your complaint. It fills in explanation of the issue. You don't have to write that. You just have to say, I couldn't use your site because it demanded running non-free JavaScript code. Please fix that. Send. In less than 10 minutes a day, you can complain to 10 different sites. And that's an important contribution to our movement because we need to convince those webmasters that they should free their JavaScript. But nowadays, there's another way to lose control of your computing without running any non-free software yourself. The old way to lose control of your computing activity was to do it with a non-free program. Then even though you've got your own copy and you're running it probably in your own computer, you don't control what it does. But the new way is called SaaS, Service as a Software Substitute. It's where you do the computing activity by entrusting it to somebody else's server. So he controls how it's done. It's done in his server by programs he chooses. You don't choose them. If they're free software, he can change them because they're his copies. You can't change them. Maybe you have a copy that you could change, but when his server is doing your computing, it's not running your copy. It's running his copy. So we call this service as a software substitute because that's what's happening. That service is replacing your running software to do the activity. the user to do this has to first send all the pertinent data to the server. Then that computing activity is done in the server by software that user can't see or touch. And then it sends back the result or takes action directly on his behalf. and that way the user loses control. In fact, SAS is equivalent to running a non-free program in ethical issues. But actually, it's even worse. I explained that many non-free programs are spyware. They send personal data to a server. Well, with SAS, the user has to send all the pertinent data to the server first. So it's the same result. The server's got the user's data. It's spying. And of course, you can presume that that server will make the data available to Big Brother. If it's a U.S. company, it has no choice under the Pat Riot Act. It's required to give the government all the data about people on a mere request. No court order needed. And then I explained how many proprietary programs have a universal backdoor that allows somebody to forcibly change the software and change how the user's computing is done. Well, with SAS, the server owner at any time can install different software in that server, and he should be free to do this. It's his computer. But when it's being used as SAS, that's effectively changing how the user's computing is done without asking that user for permission. So SAS is inherently equivalent to running proprietary malware, which spies on the user and has a universal backdoor. We have to reject SAS. The issue of SAS arises when you're doing a computing activity that's your own. But we also do joint computing activities, like if you're communicating with somebody else. That activity is not yours, it's a joint activity. You can't expect to have full control over that. Other people's computers have to be involved. So if a server is involved too, it's not much of a change if network hubs are involved already. So the SAS issue doesn't really arise for your joint activities. It arises for the activities which are yours. The way you can tell what's your activity is with a thought experiment. Imagine you had the biggest computer in the world and whatever software you want. Could you do that activity inside your computer? If yes, then it's your activity. And you could have full control over it, so you deserve full control over it. But if the answer is no, that's because somebody else is involved in the activity, so it's not yours, and you couldn't possibly expect to have control over it. For instance, a search engine is not SAS. It's not substituting for software, because what it's doing is communication. It's mediating your communication with all the world's websites. You could visit all the websites yourself, or you can go through a search engine which visits them for you. But either way, what you're doing is communicating with everybody that has a website. And that's not something you can do by yourself. You couldn't do that inside your own computer because you have to look at their websites. That's the whole point. So that's not something you could, since it's not something you could do by yourself, you're not losing anything by you in terms of control of your computing by using the search engine. Now, there are other issues, ethical issues that arise for search engines. The joint computing activities we do, when we use servers to do them, there are good and bad things those servers can do, but they're different. They're not comparable to the issue of free versus proprietary software. For instance, a search engine might track you, it might have a filter bubble, but a filter bubble is a different kind of thing from proprietary software. I prefer to use a search engine which doesn't have a filter bubble. But I couldn't possibly do the searching of other people's websites inside my own computer. So it couldn't possibly be analogous to a free program. The last point I want to make is about free software and education. All educational activities, including all levels of schools from nursery school to university and adult education too, must teach exclusively free software. This is their ethical obligation. And this is not a matter of saving some money. That's a secondary benefit, which is nice when it can happen. But this is not about how to make education a little better. This is about how to do good education instead of bad education. Teaching a non-free program is bad education. It's implanting dependence, imposed dependence on one particular entity. It's wrong. It should not be done. Because the school has a social mission to educate good citizens of a society that is strong, capable, independent, cooperating, and free. In computing, that means teaching people to use free software and graduating users accustomed to free software and ready to be good citizens of a free digital society. Schools must never teach a proprietary program. But why do some developers of proprietary software offer gratis or cheap copies of their non-free software to schools? It's the same reason why tobacco companies used to hand out gratis cigarettes to children. They want to use the schools to get the students dependent on their products. Schools must not cooperate with this. Even if it seems tempting, they must refuse. But there's a deeper reason for the education of the best programmers. Some people are natural-born programmers. At the age typically of 10 to 13, they become fascinated with computing, and if they use a program, they want to know how it works. But when the kids ask the teacher, how does it do this? If it's proprietary, the teacher has to respond, it's a secret we're not allowed to know. Thus, education is not permitted. Every program embodies knowledge. If it's proprietary, that's knowledge withheld from the students. The proprietary program is the enemy of the spirit of education, so it should not be tolerated in a school except for reverse engineering. But if the program is free, the teacher can explain whatever much he knows and then give each of the students a copy of the source code saying, read this source code and you'll understand everything. And those kids, being fascinated, will read it because they yearn to understand everything. And the teacher can say, if you come across a point in the code where you get stuck, show it to me and we'll figure it out together. That gives our natural-born programmer the chance to learn a vital lesson. That code is badly written. You shouldn't write code that way. You see, to advance from natural-born programmers to good programmers, they have to learn to recognize what's good code and what's not. And the way you recognize bad code, learn to recognize what is bad code, is the hard way. You try to understand some bad code and you see how hard it is. And then you realize, I shouldn't do that. How do you learn to write good, clear code? You do it by reading lots of code and writing lots of code. Well, only free software gives you the chance to read the code of large programs we really use. But then you have to write lots of code. You have to write code for large programs. But in order to learn to deal with the challenges of code for large programs, you have to start small. What does it mean to start small in tackling the challenges of large programs? It doesn't mean writing small programs. That's not even starting. No, it means writing small changes in existing large programs. And then you can advance to writing bigger and then large changes in large programs. But only free software gives you the chance to write changes in the code of large programs we really use. Any school can offer students the chance to master the craft of programming if it is a free software school. But there's an even deeper reason for moral education in citizenship. Schools must teach the spirit of goodwill, the habit of helping other people. Therefore, every class must have this rule. Students, if you bring software to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share copies with the rest of the class, including source code in case someone here wants to learn, because this class is a place where we share our knowledge. Therefore, it's not permitted to bring proprietary software to class except for reverse engineering. To set a good example, the school must follow its own rule. It must bring only free software to class and share copies, including source, with everyone in the class that wants them, except for reverse engineering exercises. If you have a relationship with a school, if you are a student or a teacher or an employee or an administrator or a parent, it's your responsibility to pressure that school to move to free software. You can start by requesting it privately, and maybe that will be enough. If not, you've got to start raising the issue publicly so as to seek allies and make more people aware of the issue, and thus build the movement until you win. Now, sometimes what you need to do is make a personal example of resistance. For instance, if you're a student on the first day of a class, you can ask, "Professor, is it possible to do this classwork without running non-free software? Because that's against my principles. I can't do that." And if a teacher says no, then you could say, "Please, let's work out a way I can do the class material and show I know what I'm supposed to know with free software, even if it takes me extra work." Willingness to do more work will inspire respect in sincere teachers. But if a teacher still says no, then you have to say, "Well, I can't take this class. Goodbye. I will try again next year. I hope there will be a different teacher and I may get a different answer." I know someone who is taking an online class at Harvard, and when he was told he had to use, I think it's Adobe Contact or Adobe Connect, which is proprietary software, he said, "I won't run that. It's against my principles." And he was told he was going to fail. And he said, "Well, that's life." Sometimes freedom requires a sacrifice. These are pretty small sacrifices compared with what people had to do for freedom before. I've met people who've said, "I'd love to use free software to do this job. Hand me some free software which is 100% as convenient as the proprietary program I'm using now, and I'll switch to it if it doesn't take any work." What they're really saying is the value they assign to freedom is zero. No wonder those people end up with no freedom. Freedom is frequently threatened, and it's threatened now. We're going to have to fight for it, and we're going to have to be willing to make these small sacrifices from time to time. I should say something about Professor Salaita. When I decided to give this talk, I didn't know that there was a boycott on behalf of how Professor Salaita was treated. And at that point, my tickets had already been bought and I didn't feel I had a choice. But I do want to say that I support him against the university, and I hope you do too. I don't think so. I read what he'd said. He condemned the Israeli occupation policies, and I suspect you might think of violence if you were subject to that occupation. It involves a lot of violence regularly against Palestinians. It involves as much as torture. Of course, that's an American tradition, but actually, the issue of academic freedom and the judgment of a professor for his political views about an unrelated issue is, it's something that people should be free to have and state various opinions about at a university. So that's a separate issue from the question of the occupation itself. In any case, I felt since I'm giving a speech here, I have to mention that. So, for more information about the free software movement, look at gnu.org. For more specifically for philosophical questions about free software, look at gnu.org/philosophy. For information about free software licenses, including which licenses are free and which are not, look at gnu.org/licenses. You'll also find there are suggestions for choosing a license for your own work. For the history of the GNU project, and the GNU system, look at gnu.org/GNU. For suggestions, for the free and non-free distributions and our criteria about that, look at gnu.org/distros. And for suggestions about how to help our cause, look at gnu.org/help. There's also fsf.org, which provides resources for using and developing and promoting free software. There are campaigns which you can sign, and there's also the shop where you can order various things that we don't have here today. And you can also become a member of the Free Software Foundation. But since I'm here, you have the opportunity to become a member and pay your dues in cash. Now it's time to present my other identity. I am Saint Ignatius of the Church of Emacs. I bless your computer, my child. Emacs started out as an extensible text editor that I had written, which became a way of life for many users as it was extended so much they could do all their computing without ever leaving Emacs. Then it became a church with the launch of the news group alt.religion.emacs. which you might find amusing to visit. In the Church of Emacs, we have a great schism between several versions of Emacs. We also have saints, but fortunately no gods. Instead of gods, we adore the one true editor, Emacs. To be a member of the Church of Emacs, you must pronounce the Confession of the Faith. You must say, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. Then, if you become a true expert, you can celebrate that with our ceremony, the Bar Mitzvah, in which you chant a portion of our sacred scriptures, that is, the system source code. In the Church of Emacs, we have eliminated the priesthood of technology because everyone is free to read our sacred scriptures. We also have the cult of the Virgin of Emacs, which means anyone who has never used Emacs. According to the Church of Emacs, offering the opportunity to lose Emacs virginity is a blessed act. We also have the Emacs pilgrimage, which consists of invoking all the commands of Emacs in alphabetical order. There is a Tibetan sect which claims that it's sufficient to invoke them automatically under the control of a script. But the mainstream church says that to gain spiritual merit, you must type them by hand. The Church of Emacs has certain advantages compared with other churches I won't name. For instance, to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. So if you've been searching for years for a church to be saintly in, you might consider ours. However, it does require living a life of moral purity. You must exorcise whatever evil proprietary operating systems have possessed computers under your control or set up for your regular use, and then install a wholly free operating system, and then use and install exclusively free software with and on the system. If you make this vow and you live by it, then you too will be a saint and you'll have the right to wear a halo, if you can find one, because they don't make them anymore. There is a traditional rivalry between Emacs and the other editor, VI. So people sometimes ask whether in the Church of Emacs the use of VI is a sin. It's true that VI is the editor of the beast. But using a free implementation of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. I visited China last year, and some VI users there proposed to get together and attack me. I was shocked, but apparently violence begins with VI. People have occasionally asked whether my Halo is really an old computer disk. This is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous life. Thank you. Now it's time for the auction. This is an adorable GNU that needs a home. So I'm going to auction it for the benefit of the Free Software Foundation. If you buy it, I can sign the card for you. if you have a penguin at home, you need a GNU for your penguin. As we all know, a penguin can't hardly function without a GNU. When you bid, please wave your arm and shout as loud as you can, because I have hearing problems and you want me to notice your bid, right? If a bid happens in the forest and nobody notices, did the bid really happen? Let's not raise that philosophical conundrum. We can accept payment in cash, with a check, with a bank card if it can make purchases by phone, or by Bitcoin if you have something here to make the payment with in front of me. And I'm going to start with its regular price, which is $25. Have I got $25 for this? How much?
25.
I've got 25. Do I get 30? 30 or more. Do I get what?
30.
I've got 30. Do I get 35?
35.
I've got 35. Do I get 40? Thanks for speaking so loud. I can hear you very well. Do I get 35? $35 for this adorable GNU. Who said, I've got 50. Do I get 55?
55.
I've got 55. Do I get 60? I've got 55. Do I get 60 for this adorable GNU? $60 to the Free Software Foundation. I've got 75. Do I get 80? I've got 75. Do I get 80? By the way, I'll be answering questions for at least half an hour. You'll have time to go to a bank machine and come back. I've got 75. Do I get 80? $80 for this adorable GNU that needs a home. $80. I've got 80. Do I get 85? I've got $80. Do I get 85 for this adorable GNU? $85 to the Free Software Foundation. I've got 85. Do I get 90? I've got 85. Do I get $90 for this adorable GNU? $90 to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom.
90.
I've got 90. Do I get 95? I've got 90. Do I get 95 for this adorable GNU?
$100.
I've got 100. Do I get 110? I've got $100. Do I get 110? I try to go up by a tenth of the price to speed things along so it won't take a long time for us all. Do I get 110? I've got $100. Do I get 110 for this adorable GNU? 110 to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom. Do I get 110? Last chance. Last chance to bid 110 or more. Last chance. Going. Gone for 100. Please come up and pay. What? Okay, well, if you have it now, you should pay it now. Oh, I see. You're going to pay with Bitcoin. Someone should work out how much Bitcoin it is. Anyway, we can do that later. So now it's time for questions. I still have hearing trouble. You need to speak loud and clearly and slowly. Please stay in one place, like it could be here, here or there, and people come and line up to ask questions. It's much more efficient, and it's also fair, because once you get on the line, you will have your turn. So stay here. Okay. Stay here close to me, and make the line here. Those who want to ask. Okay. Because if you speak fast, I won't answer everything again.
Hello. I have a question about LLVM and Clang. This is the home site development for LLVM and Clang, as I understand it. And I understand there was a controversy about the non-copyleft free software license they chose.
Basically, Clang is a C compiler. I developed a C compiler called GCC 25 years ago, actually 26 or 27. And because GCC is copylefted, many companies found that they simply had to release their changes, their extensions, their ports to various computers as free software so that they could do it using GCC. Because now, Clang is not a bad thing, it's free software. But replacing a copylefted program with a non-copylefted program makes our community weak. So the result is that now companies that don't care about our freedom, like NVIDIA, can make proprietary compilers. They can make compilers for secret architectures. This is very bad for our community. And they can do this because the developers of another free program used a weak license. What's especially, now this kind of thing happens whenever some free program uses a pushover license, but it's especially important here because of the fact that it means that it's easier for processor architectures to be kept away from us so that it's impossible to run anything on them in the free world. This is a big setback.
Dr. Stallman, first let me tell you happy birthday and many more. And
That's nice of you.
And I cannot thank you enough.
Well,